All right. Well, hello again, everyone, and welcome to the Conversations on Ocean Carbon webinar series. We're really excited to put on our 13th webinar today. My name is Melanie Herrera, and I'm a senior fellow with the California Ocean Science Trust, and I'll be facilitating today's webinar on mCDR lessons from the field, Ebb Carbon's Project Macoma. We're thrilled to have such a diverse group of attendees joining us from across time zones and disciplines, so thank you again for joining us. This webinar series is brought to you by Pacific Coast mCDR Collective, a group of science-based institutions and organizations working to strengthen coordination, knowledge sharing, and strategic alignment across mCDR efforts along the Pacific Coast. This includes Alaska, British Columbia, California, Oregon, and Washington. We'll drop a link in the chat. I think we already did, so you can learn more about our work. And on your screens, you'll see the faces behind the collective. This represents the Alaska Ocean and California Current Acidification Networks, California Ocean Science Trust, Carbon to Sea Canada, Stanford University, the Southern California Coastal Water Research Project, the Pacific Northwest and California Current mCDR nodes, Washington Sea Grant, and Oregon State University. We really couldn't host this webinar without our partners, so a big shout out to them. Today, you'll hear a deep dive on Project Macoma from Mallory Ringham, Head of Ocean Science at Ebb Carbon. Then you'll see the rest of our speakers will join us for a live Q&A, including Jesse Vance, oceanographer and ocean modeler at Ebb Carbon, Jeremy Loretz, Principal Chemical Engineer at Ebb Carbon, and Irene Polney, Vice President of Programs at Carbon to Sea. And here is a quick overview of our agenda. As I mentioned, Mallory will kick us off and share on Project Macoma. Then Irene will actually join us and speak briefly on Carbon to Sea's next steps with the project. And then, as I mentioned, our remaining speakers will join us and we'll be able to answer all of your questions. So I want to start with a couple logistical reminders. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be posted to YouTube and shared out in the following week. So keep an eye out on your emails. And throughout today's webinar, we're going to have two ways for you to engage. You should have a Q&A function at the bottom of your screens, and you can feel free to use this to submit questions for our speakers all throughout the webinar. And then you'll see that we also have a dedicated chat box where we'll be sharing resources like the links on the collective earlier. So feel free to check that for resources throughout our presentations. And then lastly, we're also going to be using some Zoom polls to hear directly from you all. So when a poll pops up on your screen, simply select the answer that best reflects your perspective and hit submit. And then we'll be able to talk about some of the results. So before I pass it off to Mallory, let's practice with a few polls now. We'll kickstart our first poll, which asks, what best describes your relationship with mCDR? Feel free to take a few moments to submit your answers. Awesome. Seeing lots of folks are part of an active mCDR project, which is great to hear. I think this webinar will be a great resource for us to share lessons learned. So glad to hear that. It looks like we have a few folks on the regulatory policy side, some other scientists with interest in mCDR. Awesome. I see the polls are slow. The responses are slowing down. Awesome. Okay, so we can go ahead and end the poll and share our results. You folks should be able to see the results of the poll. We got most folks, 35% are part of an active mCDR project. Then the next biggest one is 20%, 27% with an interest in mCDR R&D. So great to hear. And a few other folks. So it looks like we got a really diverse group. Awesome. Okay, let's move on to poll number 2, which asks, where do you live and or work? And feel free to check off more than one if your region of focus is different than where you live. You'll see we have options across the Pacific Coast, and then other parts of the US and outside the US. So feel free to take a few moments and add those in. Awesome. Seeing lots of folks from California, a good amount of folks outside the US as well. So far, 20%. That's awesome. Great to hear that we have a global community here. We have some other folks outside the US. So yeah, great diversity. I think we can go ahead and close that poll. Hopefully you can see the results on your screen. Um, yeah, awesome. And then we'll move on to poll number three. That'll be the last one for this section. Feel free to submit your answers for do you identify with any of the following communities? And feel free to select all that apply. So a lot of folks on the academic side to be expected. A lot of NGO folks, government, private industry. Looks like we have a pretty equal diversity here amongst those sectors. So I'll pause for another moment for folks to be able to add their votes in. Awesome. Okay, let's end that poll. Looks like they're slowing down. Yeah, thanks for participating. Always a great opportunity for us to learn about you guys, our audience, and hear who's interested in some of these subjects. So appreciate that. So yeah, thanks everyone again for joining. I think this is a great time for us to just dive in. And don't forget to submit your questions in the Q&A function. And with that, let's kick it off. Mallory, you can join us and I'll pass it off to you.
Great, thanks. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. That'll take a minute to pop up. All right. So diving right in. So for anyone on this call who hasn't met me, and I'm assuming with the number of participants we've got, that's a lot of you. I'm a chemical oceanographer. I'm head of ocean sciences for Ebb Carbon. So we're a California-based company developing technology for marine carbon dioxide removal. And as part of that, we've run two different types of field trials now, and we're in the stage of trying to share out what we've learned from this field site to help clarify what's being done already and to help set the stage for what other groups can do in the future. So because this is an mCDR collective, I'm assuming that there's a general familiarity of greenhouse gas and climate change impacts as well as mCDR. But I do want to start with the reminder that CDR is not a replacement for drastic fossil fuel emissions reductions. So the role of CDR is to address carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in its role as a pollutant. Even with drastic emissions reductions, we have sectors that are difficult to abate, like heavy industry and aviation, carbon that we continue to emit during the energy transition in the future, and then all of the legacy carbon emissions we've put out in the atmosphere so far. Even if we stopped burning fossil fuels immediately, it would take a long time for Earth's climate and temperature to stabilize, and that will come with continued impacts of climate change, sea level rise, weather patterns, ocean acidification, and so on. According to the latest reports by the International Panel on Climate Change, in order to stay within the range of global climate agreements, our target is removal on the order of 10 gigatons of atmospheric CO2 every year by 2100. It's a massive target. We currently emit something on order of 40 gigatons of CO2 per year. And right now we're doing only a very small amount of removal based on conventional approaches, forest management, some soil carbon. Novel terrestrial and marine CDR methods are kind of in the 2 megaton range for CDR. So we're talking orders of magnitude of scaling. We have a long way to go in developing different technologies, and we know that there are going to be many parallel approaches that are required for carbon removal to stack up to the necessary removals. So the method that I'm describing today falls into the category of ocean alkalinity enhancement, or OAE. The reason we're interested in OAE is that it has a strong potential to scale, both in terms of deployable tonnage of carbon removal and potential costs for that removal. So broadly, mCDR is novel, but there has been substantial progress in the last few years as we've moved out from the laboratory and into the field. We've heard a great deal of interest in learning how that research has progressed and interest in learning about how field trials have been designed and managed. I'll say that I'm a scientist by training. In the oceanographic world, we typically don't have mechanisms to share results quickly. And holding a webinar to share ocean science is pretty unusual, but I think it is helpful because this speeds us a little bit past the scientific peer review to share what we've done. And it gets us a little bit away from conference talks that maybe are only 10 minutes. It's very difficult to dive into detail on projects that are in the real world with many dimensions. This talk is intended to describe how Ebb's research pilot, Project Macoma, was designed and operated, and to share how decisions were made in moving this technology out into a coastal environment at increasing scale. This was a very big project, so we're not going to be able to dig into a lot of the work that we've done. So that includes a lot of engineering developments, life cycle assessments, techno-economic assessments, and a lot of the work in ocean modeling. So as I go, I'm going to try and point out where that information is upcoming. Before describing the pilot, I want to lead with the takeaways. So Macoma is a unique project. We've seen very few alkalinity enhancement field trials to date, and even fewer sustained releases of alkalinity into the ocean environment that stretch to weeks, months, years. As a standalone research pilot, Macoma was permitted specifically for the purpose of mCDR under the US Clean Water Act. We did not use an existing ocean outfall to release alkalinity, and that impacted how the project was designed. We released alkalinity over a period of 6 months that came with many phases and decision points along the way to ensure that we are operating responsibly. And that's something we really want to highlight, is to think about what stage gating could look like for specific projects in the field. And throughout the project, the impact of alkalinity release on the marine environment was very small. So I'll show it's limited to the immediate surroundings of the alkalinity release as far as measurable carbon changes and measurable water chemistry changes are available for us to see with the tools we have now. We saw no measurable impacts on marine species present in the project area. So backing up to the method, there's a variety of different approaches to do carbon removal in the ocean, and there's often confusing overlap between those approaches. So Project Macoma is a research pilot for electrochemical OAE. So that's the figure that's in the middle. And in this method, we generate alkalinity by removing acid from seawater. There's a lot of overlap between this method and the one on the left, which is mineral or enhanced coastal alkalinity. These approaches bring mined or industrial waste sources of alkalinity to the ocean from somewhere else. Both methods are adding alkalinity to the surface ocean with the goal of adjusting seawater carbonate chemistry in a way that prompts additional absorption of CO2 from the atmosphere or reduces degassing of CO2 from the ocean. And the final fate of carbon stored in these methods is as dissolved inorganic carbon in the ocean. There's also significant overlap between electrochemical OAE and other forms of marine carbon removal, like direct ocean capture on the right. So direct ocean capture can also use electrochemistry, but in this case, they use it to strip carbon dioxide from seawater, and that carbon dioxide is stored somewhere else, like geologic reservoirs. Direct ocean capture can also release into seawater a solution that's depleted in dissolved inorganic carbon, and that can result in some similar uptake of carbon into the oceans with storage as bicarbonate. Over the next many iterations of development and scale for the foreseeable future, these three methods are coastal. So that's for logistics reasons and governance reasons. This is not going out to the open ocean. We know through modeling studies that significant carbon removal can be accomplished in the coastal oceans, and that strongly impacts our research priorities, especially when we're thinking about monitoring and assessing positive and negative impacts on the environment. These methods can be adapted to integrate with existing coastal utilities and industries. So that may include power plants, wastewater, and so on. That's an opportunity to reduce energy and capital requirements for CDR and can provide benefits for the host industries. So that type of acceleration for mCDR development and scaling is exciting, but there's also a bit of a drawback sometimes when we're thinking about how pilot projects are designed. If we release a small amount of alkalinity into a large existing outfall, our ability to track the dilution of that alkalinity into sea and water impacts is very minimal. So we need field trials to advance the science behind mCDR, and we also need different types of field trials to answer different questions in the marine environment. Ebb's technology generates alkalinity from seawater or brine. So we're using bipolar membrane electrodialysis to break salt water into acid and base streams. So in this method, we apply an electric field as we push salt water through a series of ion-specific membranes. This concentrates negative and positive charges in different streams. So we get hydrochloric acid, which is removed for other purposes on land, and a base, sodium hydroxide, which is the source of alkalinity that is returned to the ocean. As the base is discharged through a coastal outfall, it can cause a local increase in pH and total alkalinity, and it decreases the partial pressure of CO2. The magnitude of those changes decreases as alkalinity is diluted into seawater, and over time, the disequilibrium between the ocean and the atmosphere drives additional CO2 across the air-sea boundary, and that results in storage of carbon in the ocean as dissolved inorganic carbon, primarily bicarbonate ions. And we expect that storage to be durable on hundreds and thousands of years timescales. This method relies on the ocean to scale. We use the air-sea surface as a contactor and for storage. And as an open system approach to mCDR, this method also relies on models to do a lot of the quantification work. And that's because we rapidly lose our ability to measure very small chemical changes in the ocean as we move away from the near field of the outfall. So to give a quick sense of the progression of this technology, the photo on the left is a small demonstration facility deployed at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, or PNNL. This is the only US national lab that houses dedicated marine research facilities in Sequim, Washington. The middle photo is showing electrochemical stacks at Project Macoma, which is in Port Angeles, Washington. And the schematic on the right is Ebb's next pilot, which is designed to integrate with desalination. The first system at PNNL has been used for several years. This is part of a public-private research partnership between Ebb Carbon, PNNL, University of Washington, and NOAA's Pacific Marine Environmental Laboratory. This collaboration was enabled in large part by the NOAA Ocean Acidification Program, and the QR code on the top right navigates to a recorded NOAA library seminar on public-private partnerships and mCDR. This slide shows a few of the studies centered at PNNL, and it captures the initial movement from the laboratory into the field. So while we were testing our electrochemical system, we generated alkalinity from seawater, and we used it in tank scale tests, so monitoring carbon dioxide uptake into seawater in a way that we can measure the full process. Our research partners tested the impact of extreme alkaline exposure on local invertebrates, and our modeling partners simulated pilot and scaled field trials from different locations in Swim Bay. Using all of this information, we designed 2 field tests. These were 2 day-long alkalinity release experiments using the wastewater treatment facility outfall at the PNNL campus. The photo on the right shows several oceanographic sensors strapped directly onto the outfall. And this slide gives some highlights of that field trial. So these were described in a peer-reviewed publication last year. 2 field tests run in November 2024 and February 2025, releasing electrochemically generated alkalinity into Swim Bay and scaling up in duration and magnitude between those 2 trials. So the time series on the bottom is showing pH data from sensors that are strapped directly onto the outfall and further downstream in the pier at PNNL. The very small increases in pH were measured less than a meter in front of the outfall, and we're releasing large amounts of alkalinity during these tests. So think 180,000 liters of alkalinity enhanced seawater over a period of a couple of hours. The limited in-water signal is due to a couple of factors. There's very strong tidal currents in the mouth of Swim Bay that rapidly dilutes the alkalinity, and that's how this outfall for the wastewater treatment plant is designed. And we also had a maximum pH of 9 at the outfall, and that has to do with the wastewater treatment facility's existing permit. So on one hand, these results are really useful. We can run alkalinity release field trials without causing much risk to the marine environment in terms of changes to pH. But on the other hand, it's hard to do additional research when you can't measure anything. So when we are ready to scale up to learn more from field tests, I built Project Macoma, which is down the road in Port Angeles, and that's where we'll spend the rest of this talk. So Project Macoma is located towards the west end of Port Angeles Harbor, which is a natural deep water harbor on the Salish Sea. The project area is in the box in red, and it's built on the port log yard around a pre-existing pier. To the west, the site is bordered by an ancient tribal village and cemetery, then a closed paper mill, and then Edith's Hook stretches around to the Coast Guard station, and to the east, there's the Port Angeles Yacht Club, Marina City, ferries, and so on. This is a very heavily industrialized area. There's a long history of human habitation, use, and pollution. And by many metrics, it's a good place for a research pilot. So from ocean models, we expect rapid and efficient ocean uptake of carbon dioxide in response to an alkalinity addition. There's extensive regional experience in carbonate chemistry dynamics, 2 overlapping high-quality ocean models that handle biogeochemistry. We have hydroelectric power, logistical support for industry, and importantly, there's an understanding of what ocean acidification means for the marine environment and economy, and that has a lot to do with social license to run mCDR trials. There's also a political will in Washington state to consider environmental remediation and climate mitigation technologies. So this is a drone photo of Project Macoma. This includes both on land and in water components. And the project works by pulling in seawater from the barge, pumping it to land for pretreatment, which includes filtration and desalination, to create a brine. That brine is then electrochemically treated to produce acid and base. For this project, the acid was neutralized on site with batches of waste brucite minerals, and the base was mixed with desalination permeate, freshwater, or seawater to reach specific pH targets. Then that alkalinity enhanced seawater is pumped back down the pier and released from the barge. You can see that we do a lot of pumping water around on this site. It's not energy efficient. This research pilot is designed to stress test OEE from the ground up. So that's permitting, controls, monitoring, environmental impact assessments, testing protocols for quantifying net carbon removal. In the future, we much prefer to integrate this work with an industry that cuts out the front half. So generating alkalinity from a waste brine stream and releasing alkalinity into an existing outfall where possible saves us a lot of effort. This is a closer look. This is the research barge Eisenman, named after Matthew Eisenman, who was one of Ebb's co-founders and a faculty member of the Yale Center for Natural Carbon Capture. There's a long diffuser outfall submerged on the outside of the barge, and the shipping container on top holds inline intake and outfall sensors. So Project Macoma received the first permit for the purpose of mCDR under the U.S. Clean Water Act. This is a 2-year permit in the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System, or NPDES, or NPDES. It's a long process. We began conversations with regulators, tribe, the port, community groups far in advance of applying for the permit, which we received in October 2024. We then constructed the site, and we released alkalinity for 6 months between August 2025 and March of this year. And then we began decommissioning the on-land equipment. So the strip of white containers, if you can see my mouse here, along the water, those have been removed. And this is to clear space for a large port stormwater drainage construction project that is ongoing this summer. So Macoma is now in a transition period. We've retained the barge, the alkalinity release infrastructure, the monitoring equipment for future OAE research on site, but without the electrochemical alkalinity generation. Okay, getting into more of the regulatory space. Tribal co-management of coastal resources is hugely important in Washington. So early engagement with tribes is a key factor in obtaining an NPDES, particularly for novel technologies. So one of the first meetings we had for this project was with the Northwest Indian Fisheries Committee, which supports 20 treaty tribes in Washington. And we deferred to the Lower Alwa Clallam tribe before we moved forward with the permit application for Macoma at this site. Community feedback shaped a lot of our initial permit application to the Washington Department of Ecology, which has delegated the authority to administer these permits by the US EPA. So the first yellow box here is SEPA review. This is the Washington State Environmental Policy Act. It includes assessment of potential negative environmental and human impacts, both on land and in water. The process involves the city and port of Port Angeles. The second box is biological assessment. In our case, we hired an engineering and environmental consulting firm, and biological opinion, which was contracted by a NOAA National Marine Fisheries Service contractor in consultation with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. So these are expert reviews. They consider whether the project has a potential to harm endangered species or their critical habitat, and outlines recommendations to avoid, mitigate, offset impacts. The third box is about water quality. So the Washington Department of Ecology considers the impact of projects that may impact waters that are already cleaner than existing standards. These yellow boxes can be concurrent. This is not a wholly inclusive list in this process, but the point is that there's multiple entities involved in this one permit. There's also multiple comment periods that can be applied depending on the project. And this process is really meant to determine potential adverse human and environmental impacts on land and in the water. And the intention is to apply controls, monitoring, and operational conditions for the projects that are allowed to move forward. Macoma is now the first example of how this permit can be used to release alkalinity for the purpose of mCDR. It's also the pathway that we need to understand if we're going to tag OAE deployments onto existing industries that are permitted under the structure. The probable effects of Project Macoma as determined within that permitting process are listed in the top red box here. So this particularly includes water quality impacts of increased pH due to the alkalinity release, recommendations that were made to monitor and mitigate environmental risk during formal and informal consultation were captured in a really unique component of the Macoma NPDES permit, which is an attached ecological safety methodology. And this expands some of the permit language, including adaptive management protocols, monitoring protocols, and voluntary studies like vegetation and sediment surveys. This slide summarizes the feedback that we received from the broader community throughout the design and permit application phase. So we talked with a wide range of community groups throughout and around Port Angeles, and we received both positive interest and some concern over the project, understandably so, as this is quite novel. Everyone we talked to wanted to know more about whether alkalinity would be dangerous to water quality and to human or marine life, particularly salmon, which is all important in this area. These concerns are going to be universal wherever OAE and mCDR deployments occur, but the specific species of interest are going to change. Unique to Macoma, this pilot is located right next door to a yacht club and sailing school, so there's understandably concern around access for recreational boating in the field site and safety. There's also concern that construction on land could pose harm to cultural and archaeological value of the site itself on land. So given our proximity to Chalitzin, this is an ancient village in the Klallam territory. It dates back to 750 BC. There's a lot of thinking that goes into how to actually construct the site. So these specific concerns really highlight the need for early conversations and real discussion wherever mCDR might be applied to ensure that deployments are right, not just for the marine environment, but also for the on-land components. The NPDES is a permit that's most interesting to most of our audiences, but it's not the only one that we have to operate in the marine environment. This is a list of 9 more. So these are agencies across federal, state, and local jurisdiction. There's a lot of thought and oversight involved in this process. So the permits for Macoma allow us to release alkalinity into the center of a mixing zone. So that's the large white oval. It's the chronic mixing zone. It's 63 meters or 207 feet from the outfall. Throughout the project, any alkalinity released from the barge-based outfall has to dilute back to excellent water quality conditions by the edge of that chronic mixing zone. The extent of measurable signals during alkalinity releases of this project were really contained to the smaller acute mixing zone. Through the lifetime of Macoma, this is a little over 6 meters or 21 feet from the outfall. Macoma was operated across phases. So this began with design, construction, and baseline data collection to characterize the existing natural environment. When we initially began to release alkalinity into Port Angeles Harbor, which was late last August, we started by releasing batches of alkalinity enhanced seawater that were smaller volume and shorter duration. So that allowed us to test monitoring, controls, and safety before moving through the gate to continuous alkalinity generation and release. Then we began operations that were termed routine. This is September of last year. Discharged alkalinity has a maximum pH in NBS scale of 9.8. So for several months, we released alkalinity under that condition, demonstrated adherence to the permit conditions, and completed some additional biological tests. And that allowed us to move into scientific operations this January. So that's a higher pH condition, as high as 12. And that has some additional criteria around total volume, testing frequency, and tidal condition. So the next few slides focus on preliminary efforts to characterize the site. These are mostly voluntary studies. The figure on the left shows the extent of the chronic mixing zone overlaid on the pier with 2 surveys. So the first is an aquatic vegetation study. This was recommended within the biological assessment and opinion, effectively for the purpose of identifying and characterizing any nearby eelgrass habitat, which is important for many marine organisms, but particularly for salmon. So we contracted a visual survey of the seabed around and far beyond the project site. We found no eelgrass, typical sparse habitat conditions for an industrial harbor. So we know that alkalinity perturbations within the acute mixing zone aren't going to impact anything that is a particular sheltering habitat, and that's really important to project design. This slide shows an example from one sediment profile imaging survey. So this is a contract to a study that a group brought in a camera slide. This was deployed at 21 locations within the project area with the goal of identifying benthic habitat and sediment conditions. We repeated this survey before alkalinity additions and 4 months after alkalinity additions to see if there were any changes in the benthic environment. There were none measurable. Results are really typical for a nearshore industrial harbor. So there's limited benthic fauna, limited sediment complexity. This slide shows a drone image of the barge during a dye study. So before we released any alkalinity at the field site, we wanted to validate that the dilution model used in permitting the project was appropriate for the alkalinity release because this is a novel purpose. We contracted an engineering firm for this work, and they ran a series of models in the EPA-supported visual plumes, which has since been replaced by Plumes 2.0. This is modeling that simulates water jets and plumes and mixing zones. And that was paired with OLI software to calculate pH within the alkaline plume as it was released from the outfall. We deployed an ADCP to validate current assumptions used in this modeling. And then we ran a dye study where a non-hazardous rhodamine solution was pumped through the outfall, and we tracked that by stationary and boat-based fluorescent sensors across ebb and flood tides. The dye is just barely visible in this image, so this arrow indicates its path. It's kind of going this way. The analysis of the dye study supported the initial results of the dilution model used in permitting and designing Macoma, so that's a helpful gate in determining that we can move forward with alkalinity release. Dye studies have been used in other OAE field trials. It's important to note that there's differences in how they can be applied. We did not run a study where dye was mixed into alkalinity to track the movement of the alkalinity. Instead, we did this dye study in advance so that we knew where that alkalinity would go, and that was a safety metric for the specific site. It's also important to know that dye studies aren't necessarily required in permitting a new outfall. They aren't often done more than once for validating dilution models, so the purpose is really to make sure that the model makes sense. The dye used is non-hazardous, and that doesn't mean that these tests aren't disruptive. So this particular study required a lot of work and scheduling. We had limited choices on when to run this test based on the tides we wanted to capture. We had to respond to community feedback, which was often conflicting. So there's a youth sailing program just to the east of our field site that operates in this area. We certainly want to avoid busy dates for that. There's big recreational fishing days in Washington, particularly king salmon season, that we can't always avoid. We use the most dilute dye conditions we could get away with while still being measurable, and partly that's to avoid attracting attention and boats into the study area, which can impact the results of the study itself. So this in itself is a bit complicated to organize in a coastal environment. Moving into water chemistry, this slide notes some of the different types of monitoring that we think about for purposes including satisfying permit requirements, testing carbon registry protocols, and advancing scientific understanding. So the green dots up here to the right, these are for regulatory purpose. So this is continuous live stream sensing of seawater temperature, dissolved oxygen, turbidity, and pH. And these measurements are concentrated on this eastern end of the pier around the edge of the chronic mixing zone, because that's where alkalinity needs to be diluted back to excellent water quality criteria. We chose working along the pier deliberately. This is logistically simpler. We can have live stream power and communications in a way that's more difficult and more expensive by buoys. But also, this is the closest side of the pier to the recreational sailing program to our east. So we wanted to make sure that any measurements that we take, if possible, they can serve dual purposes. And if one of those purposes is helping a bit on the social license side, ensuring people that they're about to sail into a region that is reasonable as far as chemistry goes, that's a good thing. The red dot here along the pier, this adds additional carbonate chemistry monitoring, specifically PCO2. This is in accordance with the isometric protocol for OAE from coastal outfalls that we tested for this site. And then the red dots up here along this barge, these are for more scientific purposes, understanding rapid dilution of alkalinity. The yellow dots on this figure are system sensors. So this is incoming seawater, outgoing alkalinity. And across all these sensors, we get a good picture of the small measurable footprint where we alter seawater chemistry. And we also get a good spatial distribution, which is important because coastal environments are dynamic and varied in biology and chemistry. So here's an example of that complexity. These figures are time series of temperature on the top and pH on the bottom for the year before we released any alkalinity. The different colors are indicating different types and locations of measurements, all surface measurements in the project area. And you can see that pH data in particular doesn't always agree. This is because of spatial variability. There's different types of biology in different regions. There's runoff. There's all sorts of different currents and seasonal and episodic events that can make the baseline very complicated. Average pH in this region is 7.8, but it does range widely around that without any impact of alkalinity being added into this environment. In this case, I'm showing the first 3 days where we released alkalinity into the harbor in August of last year. So that's the vertical yellow bars. The time series now shown are across a few days. So it's temperature and salinity on top, then dissolved oxygen and chlorophyll in the middle, and then pH on the bottom. The lines are different locations throughout the project area, with the darkest ones being measurements from the barge. So the blue arrows on this plot point to 2 large pH swings. These aren't due to the alkalinity release at all. They predated alkalinity releases, but they're correlated with increases in temperature, dissolved oxygen, chlorophyll. It can be really difficult to tease apart the sources of chemical variability in the coastal environment, especially in the early stages of a field pilot. So in this slide, I'm showing the conservative model results from visual plumes and OLI software. This predicts maximum pH in front of the outfall, moving away from the outfall under routine operations. The red and blue lines on the left plot show 2 different scenarios, assuming 2 different ambient currents into which alkalinity is diluted. Real currents measured on site fall somewhere between those 2 lines. And now I'm layering in real data collected throughout the lifetime of the project. So the gray bar on the bottom left of this pH plot, this is the average and the range of natural variability across the field site. The black dots and their error bars are the average and range of pH measured within the flow of alkalinity in front of the outfall. So the real data falls well below the model predictions. This indicates that these models are conservatively appropriate in representing this project. and they show the real measurable footprint of our impact on water chemistry due to rapid dilution. So the pH signal is indistinguishable from the baseline within the acute mixing zone, which is the blue section of the plot, 6 meters or 21 feet from the outfall. We don't come anywhere close to using the chronic mixing zone, which is the white section of the plot, and actually would stretch out 5 times longer than the length of what I'm showing. The right is an example of 2 days of routine operations. The yellow bars are several hours of alkalinity release. The top plot is pH, the bottom plot is PCO2, and all of the lines across these plots are measurements at different locations around the project site. We only measured small and very temporary shifts in these parameters during the vast majority of Project Macoma. And then this slide is where things get a little bit more interesting. So we wanted to go to higher pH to think about scaling, to think about secondary precipitation, to think about a variety of different edge cases that might impact how we would operate Macoma in a different way or in different configurations in the future. So on this slide, I'm showing similar information for higher pH releases during those scientific operations. So the left now shows the conservative predictions for these tests. And then the black dots are the average and range for some of the data collected during these tests that match up really nicely with the models. And so in this case, we're mixing alkalinity with fresh water, bringing that pH down below our permit limit of 12 and sending it out the outfall. And here I'm showing the outfall when we're releasing alkalinity mixed with fresh water. But if we change that and we mix alkalinity with seawater, things shift a little bit and our measurements fall away from the model. So this is due to mineral precipitation, and this is a key priority for OAE research in general. In this case, this outfall is showing clouds of brucite or magnesium hydroxide being pumped through the outfall. Most of that brucite dissolves in seawater, and when that happens, we extend the pH and PCO2 signal further away from the outfall. This slide shows some of the ways that we can avoid precipitation up front. So the time series here are now showing pH on the top and turbidity on the bottom, and these are measured by sensors that are before the outfall itself, so within the system and before alkalinity is released to the harbor. So this first mode, the yellow one on the left, this is again alkalinity that is diluted with fresh water or desalination permeate. It's diluted in, or it's depleted in magnesium, so we're not producing brucite within the signal. And there's zero turbidity here. So it's a nice clear signal and that gets pumped out the outfall and it dilutes very rapidly into the ocean, which I'll show in the next slide. This second mode is again mixing this alkalinity with seawater. But in this case, there's a lot of magnesium. There's a great potential for brucite formation. There's plenty of time for minerals to form as that alkalinity is being pumped down and out the outfall. And we see that in this high turbidity signal. So when we move to the similar data that is for another day of scientific operations in water, these are all sensors that are arrayed in front of the outfall at different locations. The first red section here, this is again freshwater mixing, no precipitation. We do see shifts in pH and PCO2, but they fall in line with the model and they're very close to the outfall itself. The green section in the middle, this is again mixing with seawater, and now we're forming brucite, and that brucite is being sent out the outfall. This will result in larger, more distant, and more persistent shifts in pH and PCO2. And that's really important because if we are forming precipitate that adjusts how alkalinity is distributed into the ocean, that also affects the downstream carbon dioxide removal, particularly if there's carbonate, calcite, and aragonite minerals that fall out of solution as well. Those don't redissolve. The yellow section on the right returns us from scientific to routine operations at lower pH. We never saw evidence for precipitation during routine operations. This type of field trial is really important for precipitation research because we need to understand these time and space considerations that are relevant to precipitation in the field. So larger flow rates, chemical variability, momentum, all things that are really difficult to capture in a lab or in a model alone. So in a field trial like Macoma, we can really cycle through lab, field, and model activities to identify, quantify, and eventually work towards methods of avoiding precipitation from an engineering context. And that's something that is really the goal here, so that we can do OAE efficiently without having to deal with this type of parameter. Or if it happens, we can quantify it appropriately and make sure that we are reducing that amount out of our end goal carbon removal figures. The two images on the right reference research in the lab at PNNL on the top and in the field at Macoma on the bottom. These are in preparation for peer review right now, so stay tuned. In a related study, we had researchers on site from PNNL working to validate carbonate chemistry assumptions in near-field models, quantifying carbon uptake in the immediate vicinity of the barge. So this slide is hinting at ongoing analyses. This is evaluation of the carbon dioxide flux before, during, and after alkalinity release. And what the team saw was that we were outgassing CO2 naturally from this field site when we weren't releasing alkalinity during these conditions. And then when alkalinity release was going out the outfall, we shift, and now we are ingassing atmospheric CO2 into seawater in the immediate context of the barge. This is something we typically have to model. If we can measure it, that's something we would like to do where we can, but it is constrained to the immediate near field. So this slide notes some topics we won't dig into today based on time. Our principal engineer, Jeremy, is online today, and he spent a lot of time thinking about how this technology operates and scales in terms of life cycle and techno-economic assessments, commercial integration, and delivery of net carbon removal to carbon buyers. A particularly interesting component of Macoma is that we desalinate seawater before the electrochemical process. So when desalination plants operate, they produce a concentrated waste brine stream that's typically disposed in the ocean. If we consume a portion of that brine for the purpose of generating alkalinity, we avoid disposing some of that brine into the ocean, which is a good thing as far as environmental conditions occur. And then our electrochemical process separates that brine into acid base and freshwater streams. We can then recycle that fresh water back to the desalination plant. This reduces the osmotic pressure that the plant operates with and can increase freshwater production at reduced energy costs. So this type of looping and industrial co-benefit is likely a key to accelerating mCDR. Another Ebb oceanographer and modeler, Jesse, is here today. So he spent most of his time working on the air-sea equilibration part of OAE. This is adapting the University of Washington's live ocean regional model to simulate alkalinity release from Macoma across a wide variety of conditions, understanding uncertainty in carbon storage due to physical and biological processes. The figure on the left, I know it's fuzzy, shows the extent of the live ocean model that can calculate air-sea gas exchange through the Salish Sea, Puget Sound, and the West Coast. In order to model OAE, we think about multiple scales. So we're moving from the high resolution meter scale in the near field to hundreds and kilometers of scales in the regional, then to the global scale for alkalinity that advects outside of these boundaries. There are many researchers working collaboratively on these topics. Macoma has been an interesting test case for other modeling systems, including Oceananigans and the Seastar system developed by nonprofit Seaworthy. We're working on the write-up for the live ocean efforts now, which will be submitted for peer review, so stay tuned on that. Turning to biological impacts, we worked with a variety of collaborators to understand potential impacts of Project Macoma, focusing first on the species that were most important to the local community. Throughout the project, we saw no measurable visual impacts on any biology present at site during any alkalinity releases, and there's a lot of experimental results that are still to come from research at the site and in related lab projects. So to touch on a few of those, on the regulatory side, whole effluent toxicology is a major component of pollutant discharge permits. In this case, we tested shrimp and juvenile topstil as a stage gate between moving from routine to scientific or high pH operations. So we worked with a lab in Port Gamble for these tests. We took in real alkaline effluent from Macoma and exposed these organisms to a dilution series of the effluent. And what we saw was during routine conditions, no difference between control and exposure tests in either species over 48 and 96 hours of continuous exposure to effluent at pH 9.7. The scientific or higher pH effluent had more of an impact on these species, but passed regulatory criteria at the edge of the acute mixing zone. These types of tests can be really useful in thinking about monitoring and engineering controls impacting dilution for future sites, but importantly, they often don't make it into the scientific literature. These typically reside in permit filings instead. We published a paper at the beginning of this year on one trial of an alkalinity exposure on juvenile coho salmon. So we designed a test that exposed mobile species to a pulse of alkalinity, and this was meant to simulate the conditions a fish might experience if they pass through Macoma's alkaline plume once. So we released routine and scientific alkaline effluent collected from the barge into tanks that held juvenile salmon that were provided by the Lower Elwha Column tribe. The mixed solution was designed to simulate conditions in the acute mixing zone. For the routine test, about 10 feet or 3 meters from the outfall, and for scientific conditions, about 2 feet or less than a meter from the outfall. Fish were monitored for 3 hours after a short exposure, and we found no observed differences in either physical conditions, so eyes, gills, flesh, or behavioral conditions like gulping, flashing, erratic swimming during those exposures. This study doesn't get us to chronic or long exposures or the potential impacts of the lifetime of a fish that was exposed to alkalinity, but it's a promising start to know what might happen to a fish that passed through this field trial. The study was designed for a commercial ecotoxicology lab, which means it can be repeated rapidly for many species that are important to communities around OAE field sites. This slide is a preview to a study just recently completed and an analysis now by collaborators at the University of Washington. So in this case, juvenile coho, chinook, and steelhead salmon were placed in a Y-maze experiment, and this is a test used to understand fish behaviors in response to a chemical stimulus. So if one arm of this Y-maze is filled with just regular seawater and the other has alkalinity, can the fish detect and avoid that, or do they swim right through? That's important to understanding what types of controls might need to be applied around a field site if fish cannot avoid this. At the field site itself, we placed juvenile Mediterranean mussels and Pacific and Olympia oysters donated by Taylor Shellfish Hatchery in front of the outfall and around the field site. This study was inspired by the Mussel Watch program that deploys bivalves as a surrogate for water pollution. In general, we expect moderate alkalinity exposure to be beneficial to shellfish based on hatchery activities that add alkalinity to protect larval shellfish from acidification. In these studies, there were no measurable differences in shell growth or survival between populations. Additional research by the shell compositions is underway by the University of Washington. And then another study with ongoing analysis was from researchers at Oregon State and University of Chicago, aimed at understanding how bacterial communities respond to alkalinity addition. So this included sampling around the barge before, during, and after scientific operations, along with incubation experiments. Finally, throughout the project itself, we watch for impacts in the field. So this include observations of bait fish, mammals, and birds passing through the field site, invertebrates and other populations growing on the barge, sensors, pylons of the pier, inspections of the intake and outfall equipment, observations of sheens or turbidity, which could also come from other sources like the marina and log yard. We worked with an environmental consulting firm to put daily monitoring protocols in place, and that included having a trained project biologist on site during novel activities like initial routine, alkaline, and scientific operations, whose sole job it was to watch for environmental impacts. We had a lot of biological activity within and around this field site. We never saw any erratic behavior or injuries of any kind. We had frequent visits from a family of otters that like to fish from a floating dock that we used for additional sensor placement. Seals live in this harbor. Once we had a visit from a pod of orcas further out in the harbor with 2 whale watching boats following them. We have a protocol in place to immediately halt all outfall activities if whales are sighted. We didn't have to use it because we weren't operating at that time, so we took their sighting as good luck for the project. So that brings us to the end of this tour. To return to the takeaways, the novelty of this site is important for development and testing of electrochemical OAE, but a lot of what we've learned is transferable to other types of mCDR. It's entirely possible to run sustained mCDR field trials that are operated safely, that allow us to learn the things we can't capture in the lab or through models. We need to work in real environments because that's where things break, get biofouled, get corroded. And it's possible to add in decision points in stage projects, stage gates that are specific to a given project, and ensure that testing scales in ways that are responsible. We also are able to bring in researchers from outside institutions, and this is really critical because researchers who are investigating all of the things that a specific field project developer can't also add to their own budget need access to these sites, and that's something that we're working to ensure continues. So Ebb is going to continue working with collaborators in the Pacific Northwest. This is both PNNL and Macoma, which is now in transition for scientific research under the leadership of Carbon to Sea, who we'll hear from in a moment. We're easy to reach by a variety of channels. And the link in the top right here goes to a live description of effectively this science talk in a long form PDF. It's a description of operation and future studies that are ongoing at Macoma. It also contextualizes data that is freely available for this site at NOAA's National Centers for Environmental Information. And with that, I'll pass it back over to you, Melanie. And I think we're ready for the next section of this webinar.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Mallory. That was such a great deep dive and sort of behind the scenes look into how the project came to be. And I know that you had to squeeze that into a small amount of time and that those efforts are so much more complex. So really appreciate you, sharing that with us. And now I'll pass it to Irene to talk about Carbon to Sea's next steps with this site. And I'll go off camera. And Mallory, feel free as well if you're comfortable or stay on, up to you. Irene, you're muted.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Mal. That was such an amazing presentation and a really impressive body of work. So super impressive. Thank you. My name is Irene Polny. I'm the VP of Programs at Carbon to Sea Initiative. I'm jumping in for just a few minutes after Mal's presentation, just to talk about Carbon to Sea's interest in what we would call extending the scientific stewardship of the site. But first, who is Carbon to Sea? We're a philanthropic funder evaluating whether OAE has a future as a climate solution, and if so, help it to scale responsibly. In our first 4 years as an organization, we funded a range of lab, mesocosm, and modeling work to help us understand the foundational assumptions behind OEE. This helped us see how OEE is likely to work, but it's impossible to know for sure without testing OAE in a dynamic ocean environment. So increasingly, we're shifting our grant making towards building a rich and diverse body of real world evidence. We advance real world evidence in 4 ways. The first is through academic scientific trials. These are marquee projects that have a huge influence on the field, both in terms of the scientific merit, but also in tackling many firsts, such as applying for a first in kind permit. The second is a play to dramatically increase the quantity and quality of field trials by creating dedicated field research sites. These can reduce the costs of conducting research and can increase the speed at which we learn. The third is a new kind of grant mechanism that lets us layer additional support for science on top of existing field activity that's already being planned and developed. And the last component is standards and toolkits. So as we get exposure to what the field needs through all of the activity on the left, we're codifying these lessons learned into standards and protocols. So examples of this are the OAE Field Data Protocol, the Data Commons, and the Environmental Impact Monitoring Framework, which you might have seen. The second pillar is what we're currently exploring for the Project Macoma site. OAE is a uniquely place-based pathway. That means the physics and biogeochemistry and biology in a particular area have really significant impacts on the success of the method. For this reason, it's really important to conduct research in a variety of environments to better understand how it could work and whether it could scale. Today, we're piloting this concept in 2 areas, in Iceland through Rosk Marine Research Center and in Halifax, Canada through a partnership between Planetary and Dalhousie. We recently announced plans for a global field research network, RFP, that aims to bring an even greater diversity of projects and physical and biogeochemical environments into the research portfolio. You should see this RFP live in just a few weeks. Macoma could be a part of this expansion. As funders in this space, we look for opportunities that offer a unique scientific value proposition and are technically and economically feasible. So when we learned that Ebb was transitioning away from the site, we funded a due diligence effort to see whether there was an opportunity to extend the work. What we've learned through our diligence is that all of the years of foundational science that Mal just shared creates a really nice foundation upon which we can advance learning. And the signal that you can measure as a result of the dispersal engineering and this permit design is extremely relevant for future research. There's also a large local talent pool of experts that can help the site deliver outstanding work, and it's a region that offers a unique biogeochemical environment as Washington State, like many other areas of the West Coast, suffers from increased ocean acidification, like Mal mentioned. We also explored a technical and economic elements of the site and learned that the engineering, the controls, and all the ocean modeling infrastructure was highly relevant for future work. And the investments made by Ebb in building out the site's infrastructure makes it an attractive funding opportunity for philanthropists. As well, we confirmed that there was a path to potentially transfer the still active permit to another organization. This would save a lot of effort and time if we work within the existing structure of the permit. These signals were enough for us to make a preliminary investment to support a transition period at the site, where we will continue to seek input from the local community, the tribal partners, and the marine CDR experts of the region. This is where you all come in. We're inviting you and your colleagues and neighbors to please tell us what you think about this opportunity. The more people we hear from, the more confident we'll be to move forward with your input. And in particular, we're interested in hearing from Indian tribes, local residents, fishers, scientists, researchers, and really anyone with a point of view on this project. You can use this QR code here or just go to projectmacoma.org, which has more information and a very brief survey. I will say that we read every single survey response, and we would really love to hear from you. Thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks so much, Irene. So great to hear about how you guys are expanding your field sites and sort of scoping out additional ways to scope out OAE efforts. So that's great. Really appreciate that insight. And I'm sure the audience is eager to dig in even more to learn more about Project Macoma. And we've had lots of questions come in. So I really appreciate that. Feel free to keep them coming as we'll continue with our live Q&A. And with that, I'd like to bring on all of our panelists on screen. Great. And let's kick it off with some introductions to Jesse and Jeremy. Jesse, why don't I pass it off to you? It'd be great to hear about your role in Project Macoma. I know Mallory alluded to some of it, but it'd be great to hear from your lens how you engaged with the project, and then we can pass it off to Jeremy for the same question.
Yeah, great. Thanks. Yeah, so I'm Jesse Vance. I'm an oceanographer with a background in biogeochemistry and global carbon cycling. They use observational data and models to understand how carbon is generally transformed and moved throughout the Earth system. At Ebb, I developed models to realistically simulate the release of alkalinity at our project sites and use that to quantify the amount of carbon dioxide removed during our deployment. So for Project Macoma specifically, this meant developing novel models for OAE simulation, which was kind of adapting and creating bespoke biogeochemical modules, using those with existing frameworks such as regional ocean modeling systems and other ones that are in development. And also developing further software to just do the data processing analysis for that quantification of the CDR and its uncertainty.
And hi, I'm Jeremy Loretz. I'm a chemical engineer with Ebb Carbon. I have a background in kind of large scale electrochemical process integration. I'm working with a lot of different types of technologies. With Ebb, I'm responsible for our system architecture and really designing all of our system processes to produce the alkalinity and doing that at low cost and high efficiency. For Project Macoma, I had my hands on a lot of parts, but it was really the upland equipment, making sure it worked well, got it going. But then I was deeply involved with a lot of the work with the ocean science team, community engagement, and permitting to make sure everything that was promised and required was getting done and being achieved by the system.
Awesome. Thank you both. Jeremy, since I have you on, I wanted to start on a quick question for you, sort of to get into sort of like the project planning phase of things. I wanted to ask what, if any, engineering assumptions were sort of validated once the project went on site? And did anything change once you were sort of like operating in the real environment? Was there anything you sort of planned ahead of time that came up unsuspecting or surprising that impacted sort of like the design and execution of the project?
Yeah, I mean, I would say probably the most impactful thing that we validated through the system operation was that we were able to achieve a net carbon dioxide removal, which was a pretty important one. We had to do some pretty deep accounting to really understand all the carbon emissions that came from our electricity and our operations, embodied carbon,
Mhm.
netting those against what we were actually able to disperse out into the ocean. So that was a pretty important one. Probably one of the biggest like real world learnings we had as we were going was the amount of alkalinity we were actually able to disperse at any given time. We had this very interesting permit with a pH 12 limit, and we had to stay within that. We couldn't exceed it. So we came up with a lot of creative solutions to try to disperse alkalinity while staying within those limits, and then allowing our science team to actually get those measurements. So we spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to actually measure small changes of pH, get observations of precipitation, and do this all within all the various constraints.
Awesome. Thanks. Yeah, I saw a lot of questions come in through the chat about sort of efficiency of the project and I think yeah, mentioning sort of like the net zero carbon is really important. So appreciate that. I'm gonna jump around here because we got some audience questions. So I wanted to pose this to the entire group. This is a policy question. They ask what policies at international, national, or subnational levels would support the rapid scale up of mCDR? It's a two-part question, so I can repeat if necessary as well. But the second part of that question is, are there any policy elements specific to OAE that would be helpful? And how much do you think the Rescue Oceans Act currently in Congress would help? Mallory, could I pass this off to you or any other folks? chance
Yeah,
for
and then I think maybe Carbon C can weigh in here, not to throw you under the bus, Irene, but this is a bit of a tricky one for us in the US. We got our permit for this site under the previous administration, and a lot of policies have changed since then. So in general, advocating for policies that support ocean technology in general is a really good thing for us. We saw a lot of excitement in earlier years about everything from monitoring technology through developing pilot projects and developing methods for early carbon purchases from the government structure. Other governments are carrying a lot of this work. Um, and I personally, my role in this from the science side at Ebb has seen a lot of changes in where we have had to focus our time. I think the Rescue Oceans Act in appropriating funds or in targeting funds for mCDR would be extremely useful again in the way that we saw initial transformative funds a few years ago.
I think that's exactly right. I'm not the policy expert at Carbon to Sea, but in general, I would say our posture is to invite as many government agencies at all levels to participate in the R&D process, not just in shaping, reinforcing the grant support, but also shaping the questions, right? So ultimately, the national and subnational decision makers are the target audience of the R&D. We want them to feel confident in the solutions that are being developed, as well as the methods that we have in regulating and monitoring those technologies. So that can only happen if all of these different agencies in various forms are engaged in the R&D process early, and we're very happy to collaborate with those organizations. The Rescue Oceans Act, we're huge supporters of that. I'm not the one that can kind of tell you all the details of it, but in general, we support it. And actually look out for a future Plan C podcast where some of the key proponents of that act will be featured guests.
Awesome. Thanks. And that sort of is a good segue to a follow-up question, which I wanted to know what sort of scientific gaps you think are still remaining after sort of having Project Macoma's site um, operating, especially when we're thinking about policy that needs to sort of support mCDR work. Are there any specific scientific gaps that you think are still remaining that we should really prioritize? Especially when we're not only educating the public, but educating decision makers. And specifically going back, Mallory, you mentioned some precipitation research. So I also wanted to know if there was any specific advancements you're looking under that umbrella that would really help
Yeah,
scale.
I'll take that first. Like I said at the beginning of this talk, we've only seen a handful of mCDR field trials hit real water, right? And that's where things really need to come out if they're going to work or not, or need to be tested in different ways. On things that are more in the efficiency sector, so does OAE work well? We need to understand that alkalinity is staying in solution so that it can actually result in carbon dioxide removal. So that means that alkalinity has to be discharged in a way where it stays at the surface in contact with the atmosphere over long amounts of time, depending on where it is. If we lose some of that alkalinity to precipitation, we are putting a lot of alkalinity into a form that we really don't want it. And we also have to think about other environmental impacts of precipitation and so on. We also have biological questions. At Macoma, we targeted a certain number of species following community feedback primarily and inviting other researchers to site who already had the access to the equipment and supplies that they needed to come and sample. There's endless types of biological tests that can and should be done around mCDR field trials generally, right? And then beyond that, we've got the modeling realm, right? So we know a lot about how to model efficiently in the ocean environment, but we also know that models are only as good as the data you put in, and they don't always agree. And there are some places where we are lucky to have a range of different models to use, and others where we don't. So validating everything we can across field trials is really, really valuable for this space.
I can add on, but Jesse, Jeremy, anything you would add?
Yeah, I can pick up from the modeling side of that. I mean, there's definitely a lot of development going into, better quantification of uncertainty across models and within models. That's just an ongoing thing. We're trying to basically use models that have been done to do kind of process-based oceanographic research for many years and apply these in kind of new ways. Another key challenge is, right, is that we're looking to integrate across these scales. of processes that haven't really been done before. Like typically in the research arena, we're kind of staying in a narrow specific research topic of a process of a certain scale, and we're trying to go from like, the dispersion level, kind of millimeter scale and scale it up to basically thousands of kilometer basin scale. And so just making sure that we are integrating across those processes is kind of an active area. And then, yeah, to Mallory's point, in terms of there's going to be a lot of research that's required to inform parameterization of things that aren't typically in the model space now, right? So including these questions around precipitation dynamics and these kinetics with mineral precipitation dilution, so that we can properly account for the alkalinity that we think we're putting into the water, and then any biological feedbacks, because that's something that just you have to numerically represent that in the model space. And so understanding how any specific organisms are going to respond to OE is something that we're going to need to invest in so that we can account for that and try to project that in the models accurately.
Yeah, I'd kind of say something along the same lines. In the physical space, is that in the really near term, we're at sort of strange scales that aren't really well studied. There's been a lot of research at like very large scales about impacts of OEE and how dispersion might look, but at these introductory scales where you're not overwhelming the system and measurements are hard to take, how do you really assess that and know what you're doing? There's a lot of work to be done there.
Plus one to both of those, and the way that we've been thinking about it at Carbon to Sea is sort of what is the data that can inform field-based decision making. There's a lot of the theoretical limits that Jeremy talked about, and the really kind of practical experiences of a handful of field trials in very specific environments. But now we need to bring those two worlds together to help us understand how it could actually scale, what that would look like, where it could make sense. And so, as much as we can kind of extrapolate from some of these field-based studies towards something that can help us make some of those decisions, I think that is really important. And I think over the next 5 to 10 years, we'll move from, knowledge gaps to R&D opportunities. I think we're going to be optimizing this for many, many, many years to kind of tweak and understand what makes sense.
Thanks, guys. That's super helpful, and appreciate answering that from all the different perspectives of policy considerations, biology, and environmental impacts. I really appreciate that. I'm seeing quite a few questions coming through the chat, sort of about site selection, sort of project planning, and then also next steps. So I want to get to some of those. I'll start with this question that says, I'm seeing Project Macoma has been stewarded by Carbon to Sea since May 2026. So what is Ebb Carbon's role right now at present with Project Macoma, and what are your guys' next steps?
I can start with that one. So we're continuing to assist in sort of some of the engineering and operations effort. We've been working to sort of scale back our presence there. Some of our equipment, as Mallory mentioned, there's a planned construction project that we had to move out of the way for. So we're planning to continue to support the project and making sure that the research continues, really at the lead of Carbon to Sea in their scientific interests.
Thanks, Jeremy. Anything to add from Irene, Mallory, or Jesse? Awesome. Okay, great. I see another audience question come in. So again, apologies, jumping all over, but want to make sure I really am able to prioritize our audience questions. I see one about seawater filtration. So maybe Jesse or Jeremy, this might be for you guys. Curious if there are any system management concerns when intaking ocean water with respect to, for example, higher productivity times or stormier conditions.
Yeah, for sure. There's lots of considerations with the intake. So we didn't go deep in all the equipment we had there, but the first couple shipping containers that were shown in that picture, that was all of our pretreatment systems. So we had intake filters to prevent any sort of large biology or other material from getting into the system to start with. And then we filtered out through multimedia filters and granulated activated carbon, so that we'd have sort of clean enough water to go through the rest of the process equipment. This is very similar operations that you would see at a run-in desalination plant or sort of other heavy users of seawater. For future systems, we plan to integrate with desalination plants that already have all this equipment in place, which would provide nice, clean process water for us.
Thanks. And that's a great follow-up for another audience question just with regards to next steps and thinking about desalination plants. So for the Ebb team, how are the scientific findings that you guys have from Project Macoma informing your next steps and your work with the Saudi Water Authority?
I took a stab at answering that in the chat, but I'll add a couple of thoughts here and then pass it over. There's a lot that we learned from the site that's really transferable. So if we're thinking about environmental impacts, we've learned a lot about what sensors we do and don't like in the field that are useful for one condition or another. We've learned a lot about the strategies for sampling that have been useful for us on site. We've learned a lot about types of laboratory trials that are really helpful. So for example, the study that we did with coho salmon with a pulse of alkalinity, that could be replicated with reef species. It could be replicated with a variety of other things that are really important to local environments. And then coming back to precipitation, that's really important when you think about places that desalination operates, which is global, but there are a lot of desalination operators that work in warm, salty, tropic waters. That changes the precipitation story in a way that we need to understand to make sure that we are being as efficient as possible.
Thanks, Mallory. Sorry, the audio got a little bit cut off at the end for me, but hopefully other folks were able to hear that. Um, Okay, great. Yeah, that's really helpful and appreciate those insights. One of the questions that I found really, or one of the thoughts that I found really compelling during your presentation, Mallory, was talking about when you guys were able to move through project phases and sort of, I've also heard a lot of feedback from folks on just talking in the mCDR field of when folks feel like there's enough substantial data to move on from different phases, or what amount of risk is um, enough to sort of, or low enough to move forward. So I wanted to ask the Ebb Carbon team how you guys sort of moved through project phases and when you felt like you guys were at the level to advance to the next stage, and whether or not community engagement played a role in that process.
I can take a start here. See, I mean, as Mallory mentioned earlier, like we started with sort of a smaller field trial with the P&L team to really understand what we were getting into. And then a lot of our sort of gates were set in the regulatory process itself. We did community engagement before we started it, but then as part of the process, we had to do more community engagement. We had to take that feedback in, and we actually changed our system design and understand what we were doing to make sure we were responsive and could meet all those criteria.
Awesome. And Irene, knowing that we have Ebb Carbon, sort of a bunch of lessons learned from them working on Project Macoma, I'm curious, you mentioned that Carbon to Sea is building a global network of field research sites. So I'm curious what Carbon to Sea is really prioritizing as they are considering future OAE research sites. And yeah, curious into sort of your selection and if there's any specific feedback you're looking for from the community to build on the work that Ebb Carbon has done.
Sure. So I can split those up and I'll start with the second half. We're looking to hear from, like I mentioned, local residents and scientists and all sorts of users of the ocean in or around that area to understand what kind of questions would they have. This is a unique opportunity because, Ebb is a private company. They have a whole lot of needs they need to consider, including their technical and engineering opportunities that maybe are less relevant for, the average person. But as a nonprofit whose goal is to create science that society can use to make decisions about its climate future, we care a lot about the questions that people have, and now is a good time to influence our R&D agenda before anything has been set. We haven't even set up, a nonprofit to store the site. So this is a really good time to get in early and influence the work. So we definitely want to hear from you guys, especially folks who, are really passionate about the area and have, questions. In terms of the global research network expansion, so I sort of alluded to where we're looking in that map, right? We have these two locations, one in Europe, one in Canada, really interesting for like a sociopolitical strategy to have these two leading, continents and geographies that are active in marine CDR research and kind of have this outstanding scientific contribution to the field. We're also looking for a range of different physical and biogeochemical environments. An opportunity in the West Coast, like Project Macoma, really offers that unique kind of ocean acidification experience, but we're also looking for different players in the global South to raise their hands, or in Asia Pacific or elsewhere in the world that are interested in this work. A good candidate would be ideally a site that has made some progress already, that maybe has a bit of an R&D agenda in mind, maybe has some scientific infrastructure that they developed for one part of their research that they could apply towards OAE. It could be a range of different things, but we're really looking to kind of have a little bit of a head start, so we're not building everything from scratch. That helps our grant dollars go farther. But we're also looking for outstanding leaders. So the kinds of leaders that can operate within, some economic and sociopolitical ambiguity around CDR and the climate, but also can lead interdisciplinary teams and be really effective advocates for the science. So we're looking for all sorts of things. And hopefully, I mean, the idea is, within 5 to 10 years, anyone who's really interested in OAE can look at the research portfolio coming out of this network and see something in it for them that helps guide their decision-making process. So it's a portfolio approach.
Thanks, Irene. And how much does like scalability go into your decision-making factor there? And I will probably bump that to the Ebb Carbon team after you and would like to ask them how they considered scalability, if at all, at this stage.
Yeah, I mean, scaling is obviously the big question, right? If this opportunity can't scale, it's not going to be a meaningful solution to climate change. So that's obviously the goal. However, we're still in research and development stages in our view, and so we wouldn't want to pass up an outstanding R&D opportunity if it happens to be in a part of the world that doesn't make sense for scaling. I would say that that would be a bonus, like an extra sprinkle on top, if an R&D site happens to be co-located with a place with a great alkalinity source or a great opportunity to integrate with industry that could help them scale. So that's definitely an advantage, but that isn't a requirement because we still, at least in our view, haven't gotten to that point yet where we can say OAE should scale. But we want to make sure that we're creating learning environments that can help us understand those opportunities and make those decisions in the future.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's very much, it sounds like, we're still in that phase of researching the next steps and if we're even able to scale. So curious, yeah, Mallory, Jeremy, or Jesse, if you guys approached it in the same perspective that Irene just said, sort of, really doing the research and seeing what comes out of it first to see if it's scalable in the Project Macoma site, or if you took a different approach to thinking about the scalability question.
All right, I'll start on that, and then maybe Jesse, if you have some thoughts on the modeling side. I think when I got involved with Macoma, I kind of transitioned over from working on the EASE-OA collaboration at PNNL, and we moved down the road to a site where it made sense to continue learning from things we are already doing. In my view, thinking mostly about the ocean environment, there's a lot of potential for doing OAE in the Pacific Northwest because it's a place for rapid and efficient CDR from alkalinity addition. But there are also a lot of other things we have to think about, right? So there doesn't have to be a straight line between developing a research pilot like Macoma, which helps us answer all the questions we need right now, and thinking about where we go next. I think there's a lot of different opportunities for Ebb's technology to be employed in different settings, but there's also a lot of opportunities for different types of mCDR to be deployed in the Pacific Northwest, and those things don't need to stand in competition.
Yeah, I guess in terms of pathways towards scaling from the modeling side, I think with Project Macoma, we were able to you know, come up with solutions basically with the existing frameworks that were possible terms of leveraging, a regional model that was already there, adapting the code base for OAE, and kind of having a lot of lessons learned going into what works in terms of simulating OAE accurately. I think a lot of that we can take towards scaling up. But then there also are kind of certain assumptions that go into the pilot scale that could potentially break down as these things kind of scale up to gigaton level deployments. So some of the things we touched on earlier in terms of precipitation dynamics and biological feedbacks, dynamic atmospheric feedbacks with atmospheric CO2, these type of things would need to be kind of addressed at certain kind of stages going forward to be able to accurately model those at scale. But that's just part of the learning pathway and research going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. Still so much to learn in this field, even though there's been so much research. So I really appreciate that. We got a couple questions on infrastructure and how Ebb Carbon, your technology and your work can be integrated with other projects and other infrastructure. So I'll start with this question. With Ebb's technology, what specific synergies do you see with wastewater plants? This is sort of tacking on to some of the scaling question. This person mentioned it seems like it could be a promising route for scaling. So, yeah, could you guys speak more? This might be a Jesse or Jeremy question again. Could you guys speak more about the synergies with wastewater plants and sort of that value or not?
Yeah, I can start. I dropped a couple of thoughts in the chat there. But yeah, I mean, so we're certainly looking to scale up and go to market with sort of larger industrial players. Desalination is the one that we've really focused on. Wastewater plants have a lot of good infrastructure that would be useful. From sort of an integration economic standpoint, it tends to be a little bit more difficult because they're smaller facilities, often owned by small municipalities, which become difficult to integrate with and have all of its own operational challenges versus sort of larger desalination plants have sort of that waste brine that they're already producing. That's our kind of key input material. And they generally have an interest in finding new technologies that can help out their current process and also help their environmental footprint. So that's really where our focus is today.
I'll just add quickly. I mean, I wouldn't have much to say from the modeling side other than that. There's a need for kind of developing real high resolution near field models so that we can accurately represent the dispersion of our material, but then like integrating with certain facilities, we would need to then be also accurately representing their outfall that we're mixing with. Products that we're kind of integrating with in terms of modifying seawater and wastewater and whatnot on that. And so that's just something that's, in the overarching scheme of the CDR quantification, it doesn't change. But in terms of how we quantify the alkalinity at our dispersion site and scale that up to the kind of regional and global scale for the broader air-sea gas exchange quantification, that we're working on the development of very high resolution near field models that eventually be able to handle those type of chemical constituents as well.
Thanks, Jesse. And I'm curious as a follow-up, how to do these sort of like integrations with large scale facilities? How does that integrate with the permitting process? And probably going back to you, Mallory, as well. I was really excited to hear about the NIPD's permit for your project, and also wanted to dig into that regulatory framework. If you guys considered other avenues of permitting or how the NIPD's permit came up and how that might interact with some of these integrations to large scale facilities like the wastewater plants or power plants.
Yeah, so I'll start with that. And in the US, the NIPD's format for operating under the Clean Water Act is something that is very, very well understood by anyone who operates an outfall for municipal or commercial or other principles. That's how they're permitted, that's how they're developed. And in a lot of other countries, the Clean Water Act is also applied in different ways. It's, depending on where you are, there are different regional approaches to that, but that's something to be a little bit cautious about, is understanding the specific regulatory framework wherever you're operating. And it is really important for us to understand how commercial players that we might want to work with operate under these settings, because in general, if you're a large coastal utility, say, and you produce water, you produce power, you produce these things, you have a lot of your own concerns, and you don't want to screw that up by trying a new novel mCDR facility, right? So there's some processes and some projects that can be integrated into coastal outfalls that don't require new permitting. That might mean that you're releasing below a pH that's already permitted. It maybe you're a small part of the outfall that's fairly immeasurable. But at some point, if you're scaling somewhere to a point where you need to break outside of the existing permits, you need to consider what comes next. I think in a lot of ways, inland, in these settings where the Clean Water Act types of protocols can be applied, this is one solution to use something that is already in place. But there's definitely a consideration of the spirit of the NIPDs. It's meant to discharge pollutants and get rid of them quickly. It's not meant to discharge something that changes water chemistry on purpose. That doesn't mean it can't be used for that, but it does mean that it's not specifically targeted for what we want to apply it to. There are things we could consider that are different permitting pathways. In Washington, there's this thing called the water quality effect source, which is a pathway that would allow exactly releasing something into the water for a purpose that's beneficial. It's never been used to regulate a project. So using that as a new permit, it could take years before a project could come online, right? And so we're at a point right now where we need all hands on deck to figure out what works in climate mitigation technologies. We kind of have to work with what we've got.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And that's something I definitely hear all the time is, leveraging the existing infrastructure and sort of expertise that we already have. So I appreciate you sort of distinguishing how the NIPD's permit could be used or not used in the future. We have so many questions coming in through the Q&A chat, so I really appreciate the audience for submitting those. We are coming up on time, so I want to close with one question, and maybe we can do a quick sort of like around the room for everyone to answer really briefly. I want to end on what sort of a looking ahead question. And I want to combine it with one of the audience questions we had on nature-based solutions. So I'll end with this question. What do you hope the broader mCDR field takes away from Project Macoma to date over the next few years? And maybe you could also speak to why OAE and mCDR strategies are worth investment in comparison to effective nature-based solutions. So maybe I could start with you, Mallory, again.
Yeah, and I'll start with the nature-based piece. I think there's a lot of really great reasons to focus on nature-based approaches to climate mitigation, right? So we want to afforest, we want to build, better ways of managing farmland, better ways of handling mangroves and salt marshes. But right now, my understanding of the state of the science, not being a specific expert in blue carbon, is that there are limitations to nature-based applications, right? We've put a lot of carbon into the atmosphere. We've been geoengineering the atmosphere and the earth for a very long time. And it's going to take a while to get us out of that. And it's going to take big projects to make that happen is my personal feeling on this. And is part of where a lot of the models are showing us we need to be. If we want to get to gigaton scales of carbon removal, if we really want to consider pathways that are realistic, as far as emission reductions and carbon removal go over the next century, we need a lot of different approaches to make that happen. And we need to be able to deploy technologies that are appropriate to different locations. It's not going to be OAE everywhere, but OAE might be really valuable in some places. And if we're not learning about it now, then that's a problem.
Absolutely. And Irene, I'm curious from your perspective, as the lens of scoping out future sites. Yeah, what do you hope specifically, maybe in the OAE field, that your field trials could expand on, or what are you hoping to gain as we're looking through these next steps of considering Project Macoma?
I mean, it's 2026, and there's only a handful of projects that can point to the kinds of results that Mal, Jeremy, and Jesse were able to deliver. So I think, if you would have asked us a few years ago, we didn't even know if this was possible. So I think that's the big lesson is that it can be done. It can be done, it can be permitted, it can be done together in collaboration with community and other partners. It can be well regulated and can be done safely. And I think this is a really important foundation that everyone can build off of. And there are 1,000 lessons in how all that happened and all the special, lessons learned along the way to enable that kind of success. But having that kind of dart on the board, I think, is hugely inspiring to everyone else who's considering this type of project. So overall, a model for how this kind of work can be done in collaboration with this academic community, the regulators, the local community is really, really essential. And then, on top of all of the other kind of scientific breakthroughs that can be directly referenced so that not everyone else has to make those same kinds of foundational steps can really help accelerate the pace at which other sites develop. So thank you.
Yeah. Absolutely. I know we're coming up on time. So for our audience members, if you have to drop off, feel free. I just wanted to give Jesse and Jeremy a chance to answer that last question. And then we're going to have a few quick polls and close. But yeah, curious, Jesse and Jeremy, I know Ebb Carbon's also coming out with findings so shortly this summer. So yeah, curious if, we'll learn a lot from that, or if there's other outstanding gaps that you're looking for the mCDR OAE field to build on.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we had a lot of success at Project Macoma in terms of, like has been just outlined by Mallory and Irene in terms of us being able to kind of have safe deployment, measurable, be it small at the pilot scale, net CDR, carbon removal. And I think we can just build on that from there. I think, to the nature-based solution aspect, I think OAE really provides a potential pathway towards, large scalability and, that could have meaningful climate mitigation. I think that if we keep having these success stories and engagement, and that fosters more permitting and policy pathways where we can scale that up and have these proof points where these projects can like show rigorous quantification as well as control and verification of kind of delivery, in which case we can build faith in a marketplace that governing bodies can build kind of carbon taxation frameworks around that will help kind of incentivize reduced emissions going forward, which I think is just kind of a big missing piece in the overall climate mitigation story.
Yeah. Thanks, Jesse. And Jeremy, anything to add on your end?
I mean, I agree with everything they said. I think you know, it's sort of a yes and we need a lot of different climate solutions to deal with this giant carbon issue that affects all of us. I think OAE is one of the most promising ways to get there and can grow to large numbers, but we need all the science that's come together and all the different research. And yeah, I mean, I think Project Macoma was a great example of sort of a we can do it. We did it safely. We want to continue growing it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for everyone joining us today. I know that we'll have findings coming out this summer, and Irene mentioned that they are taking public input. So, still lots of ways to engage with Project Macoma. And with that, I want to take us to one last poll. I would like to launch a question that asks, which aspect of field pilot projects do you think generates the most valuable learning for the mCDR community? So audience, feel free to take a second to look through the options and answer. I think this would be really helpful to understand based on this discussion, your guys' input on sort of where we should or where you desire, prioritization on some of these topics. So take a few moments. Since we're over time, I will close this shortly. We'll give it maybe like 10 more seconds. I'm seeing a lot of folks voting for environmental monitoring results and community engagement approaches. One thing we didn't get to talk too much today was about monitoring, reporting, and verification development. So that's another one that I see getting a lot of votes in. I think we can go ahead and close this and appreciate folks who also voted that all are equally important. And I think Project Macoma really helped, demonstrate how we can factor in all of these considerations and do so responsibly and safely. So I really appreciate that. With that, our time has come to an end. So a round of applause for our panelists for taking the time to really pass along their insights on where Project Macoma has gone to date and where it will go in the future. If you're interested in future webinars or the work of the Pacific Coast mCDR Collective, you can check out this QR code on your screen. And with that, just thank you to the audience and thank you to our speakers again for making this such an engaging conversation. I hope you guys have a great rest of your day.